Meera, one slide.
This is on YouTube or am I watching you on YouTube or this thing? Good evening, Mrs. Nair. I can see you there.
Hello.
Yeah. So.
Oh, Dhruti is there.
This is YouTube. No. That means it's YouTube. I have to go.
What has happened?
Start up.
Okay, go ahead and start the Singanjana.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A warm welcome to this evening's Colors of Glory virtual meet. I am G.S. Simhanjana, one of the coordinators of this event. This is one in a series of fortnightly virtual meets we have been hosting ever since the pandemic set in last year. While the regular attendees of our events do not need to be told what our organization is about, kindly bear with me through a brief introduction for the sake of the new attendees, whom we are delighted to welcome. Traditionally, our country never lacked organizations celebrating our heritage in almost every sphere of human activity, be it art, literature, or politics. However, for whatever reasons, the Indian Armed Forces do not really enjoy this privilege. It is this grave anomaly that our founders set out to rectify by raising Colors of Glory Foundation, the first of its kind in India 5 years ago. Today, we are proud to assert that we have carved a niche for ourselves, celebrating the heroism of our men and women in arms, past and present, through innumerable events, outdoor and indoor, varying from battle reenactments and commemorative marathons to documentary shows and intercollegiate military history quizzes. Our website features over 120 popular blogs. We have a pan-Indian membership base of both armed forces veterans and civilian gentry, and some overseas members as well. We are confident of scaling loftier heights once we see the last of COVID-19. Meanwhile, we invite all of you who are not yet members of our organization to join us in our unique mission. Please visit our website to know how to join. I'm delighted to give you all a glimpse of the road we have traveled so far through this brief presentation.
There's no audio, Singanjana.
Is there no audio?
No audio.
Oh, just a moment, I'm sorry. Thank you. I now invite Captain D.P. Ramachandran, sir, to introduce today's distinguished speaker. Sir, please.
Thank you, Singarina. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Before I go into introducing our distinguished speaker, some of the regular attendees of Colors of Glory events might be wondering, how come we have an event which is not totally armed force related, which we always do. We are actually already in discussion with a lot of entrepreneurs, young entrepreneurs in India who is on to tech startups, defense-related tech startups. I thought this would be a good curtain raiser. Globally, the impact tech startups have on India. Now, coming to the introduction part of it, it's my pride and privilege to introduce somebody whom I know. Please mute, please. Yeah. Someone whom I know for most of his life. I know Dhruva from the time he was a 6 or 7-year-old kid, and watched him grow up into a great achiever. So for me, it's almost like introducing a grandson of mine. So I'll, without much ado, I'll go into the formal introduction part of it. A doctoral candidate in the Oxford Department of International Development, Dhruva Bhatt holds an MPhil in Development Studies and was awarded Rhodes Scholarship in 2017. He is currently researching on issues related to education, employment, and entrepreneurship. Earlier, he had completed his bachelor's in economics distinction from Harvard University and has been a primary research fellow at the Harvard Business School. His academic pursuit has been studded with outstanding achievements that have earned him multiple laurels, including premier research grants. A dominant feature of his academic record is his deep involvement in debating, and as such, he has been a president and member of the Harvard College Debating Union. Currently, he is also the coach and head of curriculum content of the Indian National Debate Team. Dhruva is the founder and director of Lumiere Education, a tech-enabled research program for high school students from around the world. It has recruited over 400 mentors from top universities and has enabled nearly 600 students from 30 countries to pursue independent research projects. This is a brief I've put together from his a rather very elaborate CV he has. So, for constraints of time. So his achievements are rather fantastic. Well done, Dhruva. Congratulations, and over to you.
Thank you so much. It's honestly an honor and a privilege to be here. I get the opportunity to share research with universities and conferences, but I think there's something special in sharing it with friends, family, and well-wishers. And so thank you for this opportunity. Also, happy Navy Day to everyone. I discovered at the start of this presentation that today is Navy Day commemorating Operation Trident. And given that it's Navy Day, here's hoping that I don't sink in this presentation and instead I'm able to float and rise to heights. So I am about to share screen on this presentation, and the title of it is Tech Startups, Their Role in Indian Political and Economic Independence. So to set the context for what I'm going to talk about, this quote by Prime Minister Modi, I think, really encapsulates the way that a lot of us sometimes feel. That these days we hear all around us, startup, startup, startup. And Modi goes on to claim it is true that this is the era of startups. And it is also true that in the field of startups, in a way, India is leading the world. This is something that it's not just politicians who make this argument. We see this from industrialists who say, this is Ambani speaking and saying small and medium businesses have a once in a lifetime opportunity to meet the needs and aspirations of 1.3 billion people. Indian entrepreneurs are capable of providing world-beating quality to meet the needs of our market at the most competitive cost. A year earlier, Ravi Shankar Prasad saying, India's moment is here. Globally, the world is looking towards India, and startups are the engines of growth. Startups are creating new benchmarks and writing a new narrative in the empowerment of India. And this is a belief that's widely shared in Indian society today. Whether we look at the headlines of newspapers that splash the giant valuations that startups are reaching on their front pages, whether it's at universities where startup clubs and entrepreneurial cells are springing up like mushrooms all across the country, whether it's in terms of who is making the Padma Shri, Padma Bhushan lists, we see increasing numbers of businessmen and startup founders joining those. And overall, there's a real buzz and energy around startups in the country. And in particular, there's this belief that startups are something that is going to help India achieve some sort of political and economic strength internationally and reduce our dependence on other countries. And I think to some extent this is true. So venture capital investment in India, which is how startups get the money that they need in order to run, has reached new heights. As you can see in the graph, setting aside the impact of COVID, or actually even with the impact of COVID, 2019 and 2020 were the best years on record for the amount of venture capital investment in startups in the country, going from just 6 billion in 2018 to over 11 billion in 2019. Another way of measuring the size of the startup ecosystem is to look at what are called unicorns. And a unicorn is a startup that reaches a valuation of $1 billion. So people are saying this company is worth $1 billion. And if it were to go public and issue stock, that's the amount of money that it would be able to raise. India has 58 unicorns, making it the country with the third largest number of unicorns behind the US and China. And so clearly there's a lot of activity. Something is happening here. And it's happening in a way that's comparatively, even to other countries, significantly higher. So this is not just a worldwide trend that India is going on. In 2020, as I mentioned, India's had over $10 billion in VC investments. In comparison, Brazil, if you want to set a developing country comparison, had about $3.5 billion. Mexico had about $1.2 billion. And even compared to developed countries, if you consider something like Australia, for example, had about $1.6 billion in 2020. So only about a tenth of where India is. Other countries were even lower. So Argentina, for instance, another developing country from the Latin American world, had about $4 billion, had about $150 million of investment in 2018. And in all of Latin America in 2020, it was about $4 billion. So the entire continent put together had less venture capital investment than India did. And the rise of Indian startups funded by this venture capital has allowed Indians to buy more and more locally produced goods and services. And so in a way, reducing our dependence on foreign corporations. So you can see, for instance, Udaan, which is a company that aims to make life easier for retailers and wholesalers, had over 15 million COVID safety essentials orders during the second wave. It's had over 3 million registered users and connects over 1 million retailers, chemists, kirana shops, and so on. So this is creating a platform that allows folks who are doing good work in the retail space to make their lives a little bit easier, to reach a much larger set of customers and make the process easier for everyone involved. We see this on the education space as well, where Unacademy and Byju's have hit millions of registered users and hundreds of thousands of paid users being active in cities across the country. You can see it in ride-sharing startups like Ola, which has had, as of 2018, over 27 million active users and more in the years since. Or food delivery startups like Zomato, which has seen over 30 million average monthly users. So these are all organizations that are founded in India, run in India, and are expanding the set of goods and services that Indians can buy from locally owned corporations. And they've also made their mark globally. So if you think about one aspect of political and economic independence being asserting your strength, asserting your existence on an international level, you can see this happen across a wide variety of startups. So Ola, for instance, which is the ride-hailing app, has started operating in Australia and New Zealand, and has also moved to the UK. Oyo, which is the hotel sort of room booking app, was already present in Nepal and Malaysia, and has recently entered China and announced plans to enter Indonesia. Paytm launched in Canada in 2017 and set up a barcode-based service in Japan called PayPay, so Paytm's Pay in Japan. You can see, for instance, Practo, which is the other startup on the top right corner, which is a healthcare app operating in over 10 countries, including Singapore, Philippines, Malaysia, and so on. So all of those startups on the top there are startups that are operating internationally and going beyond the boundaries of India to become something that people all over the world are using. And it's not just that they're expanding into other countries, they're even acquiring foreign companies. So you see, for instance, that Oyo bought an Amsterdam-based group called the Leisure Group, which is a vacation rental company. Byju's has had a string of acquisitions, including US-based Osmo and Tinker for over $100 million. Zomato has bought a company called Urban Spoon for over $50 million. And so all of these organizations are asserting India's presence, not just by serving customers globally, but even buying out foreign companies and making it part of their operations. And in particular, this growth, I think, has reduced India's dependence in sectors that are important for national security. So Captain Uncle requested that I tie this back to national security in some ways. This is not my area of expertise in any way, so this is just some extra reading that I did, but I thought it would be interesting to share. So looking at two sectors in particular, energy and defense, the growth of startups has helped India reduce the price for solar energy to numbers that have never been seen before. So whether that's a company like TrueSun, which is founded in 2018 and can install solar panels for 12 to 15 lakhs, which can then last for up to 25 years, or those that are doing much more grassroots work like Nature Tech or Mera Gaon Power, which are providing solar power to villages in Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, and in Sitapur in the latter case. There's a number of these that are creating new technology, creating new business models that tries and makes energy cheaper and reduces our reliance on foreign oil in a way that can really enable us to be energy independent. And as a result of that, both of these startups as well as larger companies, solar prices have fallen by 90% over the last year, and in a way that suggests that this could really be an important part of our future trajectory. We also have a number of defense startups, ranging from those that make drones that can help detonate and blast landmines, creating robotic life buoys that help locate stranded people in water, or UAVs, which are unmanned aerial vehicles, so that can be used by defense organizations and police departments. So you have these based across Bangalore, Mumbai, Chennai, all over the country, to try and increase our ability to defend ourselves and protect against both external and internal threats. So there's definitely some evidence to support the idea that in terms of trying to establish an Indian identity globally, in terms of reducing our dependence on other countries, startups are doing something and are contributing in a pretty significant way. But the real question underneath that is, to go back to the title of this talk, do they help in furthering our political and economic independence, and what does it even mean to say that? And so in that context, I want to take the story that I presented so far, which says, woohoo, Indian startups leading the way, doing great, and complicate it a little bit and ask, what does it even mean to say being politically and economic independent? So if you look at startups currently and venture capital funding, the majority of it is money that's coming from abroad. So these are either foreign venture capital companies or venture capital companies based in India that are raising money from other sources that are buying up these stakes in startups in return for investment. And so when Bharat Pay, for instance, a payment platform, became a unicorn, it was after receiving $370 million from Tiger Global, which is an American firm that has been super active in India recently and has made a large number of investments across a number of different startups. The number that we kept coming back to from 2020 about being more than $10 billion, that was primarily raised by just two major funds that were both closed by Sequoia Capital and American venture capital firms. So just that one company raising a fund for, and raising a fund means putting together money from which it'll invest. It raised the India Venture Fund, which was $500 million, and the India Growth Fund, which was $820 million, and that was equivalent to 40% of all of that money that we talked about earlier that made 2020 such a landmark year. The numbers are unclear because companies, I think, are a bit wary of putting this out there, but estimates say that anywhere in the range of about 80% of funding comes from foreign companies, and of the top 10 venture capitals firms in India in 2020, a number of them, like Tiger Global and Sequoia, were from the US. SoftBank, which is another popular one, which is invested in Paytm, for example, was from Japan. SteadView from the UK, Axel from the US, and Tencent from China as well. So a huge amount of this money is coming from abroad, and this is the money that startups are dependent on to continue succeeding. And many companies that we are proud of and that we think of as Indian startups are actually incorporated abroad. So Flipkart, InMobi are both companies that are incorporated in Singapore, which is a very popular place for Indian startups to be incorporated because of it's close enough to India that you don't have to worry about travel and things like that, but it's also got a court system and legal codes that are a lot clearer and a lot more dependable for companies than India's is. Freshworks, which recently went public, is based in the United States. Over 200 startups are registered in Estonia. And so once again, these are companies that are based in India that we're proud of, but are, in terms of their legal identity and nature, in terms of which governments they are directly accountable to, in terms of taxation, pretty significantly foreign in their nature. And finally, what happens to these startups as they grow and develop? A number of their successful exits, which is the term for how a startup eventually returns money to its investors, were by being bought out by foreign companies. So the biggest one that we may have all heard of was Flipkart, the pride of Indian e-commerce, being bought by Walmart for $16 billion. Redbus, which is another startup that's very popular, that's made buying tickets for buses in India a lot simpler, was purchased by a combination of Naspers, which is a South African fund, and Tencent, which is a Chinese fund. And then we have others bought by funds or companies from Netherlands, Japan, and so on, which then means that in the way that they have gotten out, they've gotten profitable and made a return for their investors is by turning into a foreign organization. And all of that investment that we have talked about, the huge amount of money, the $10 billion, all of that's coming in, is at the end of the day being driven by geopolitical trends. And I want to highlight two that I think are not understood or at the very least not talked about as much as I think it should. The first is a large part of why there's so much money coming into the country is because there's so much more money out there. And that's been because since 2008, but particularly in the last few years, both in the US and the European Union, the central bank has engaged in processes called quantitative easing and open market operations, where they buy back bonds from the market and in return print currency and put it in the hands of people. Interest rates have been very low, and they've done this in an attempt to drive them down further. And what that means is that money that is in the hands of people now doesn't have anywhere to go because growth rates in developed countries have been lower. And so you have this huge influx of money looking for places to go, which has directly contributed. This increase in what's called liquidity has led to them looking for more places to invest. And India has been a real beneficiary of that. And the question becomes, as inflation rises in the Western world, as COVID recedes, whether, and those interest rates start to go back up, and the government and the Federal Reserve and the central banks stop those policies, whether we'll be at the mercy of investment falling, and all of this that we're proud of, that we see as really a sign of Indian potential and success, will start falling backwards. It's also driven by issues with China, where a significant amount of the investment used to go over the last decade, but has been hit by a number of issues, ranging from the Chinese economy looking shakier, for instance, with housing prices in China really falling. It's driven by, in China, a crackdown by the Chinese government on the tech sector, which has made investing in technology in China even riskier. And of course, the increasing political tensions between the US and China, which make it a little bit politically incorrect, a little bit risky, because you don't know how the situation might change, the laws might change, to put that money that you have into China. And so now they're looking for other places, and India has been a big beneficiary of that. But once again, becoming an investment destination because of two global powers who are headlocked against each other isn't really the most fun place to be as a country, because you're sort of at the mercy of those headwinds and what happens in the relationship between those countries. And so what I want to suggest is that today's world is fundamentally interconnected. You can't escape these geopolitical trends. You can't escape the fact that companies are investing across different countries. You can't escape MNCs that are headquartered in one country but operating in many, many other countries. You can't escape the fact that you might be bought up by a foreign company. And I want to suggest that that's fine, that the idea of political and economic independence is really something that is a bit of something that's staying with us from our anti-colonial struggles, where we have an instinctive dislike of being dependent on others or being interconnected with others, and wanting to see ourselves as being self-reliant and independent, when in reality that sort of thing isn't possible or realistic in a world that's as interconnected economically and technologically as we are today. And in fact, I want to say that focusing on how the valuations of companies or the expansion plans of companies or the purchase of other companies represents sort of India being at the top of the world and India being progressing ahead, sort of distracts us from the real questions that we should be asking, which is, are startups helping solve our most pressing problems? Whether that is taking a real look at whether an organization like Byju's is moving the needle at all in the number of students who are gaining access to education and their learning levels. We know that if you look at reports from an organization like Pratham, for example, that only about 40% of students who are in grade 3 can read at the level of a grade 1 student, and that number has fallen during COVID. That only about 60% of students in standard 3 can recognize double-digit numbers. Those are scary statistics about education in India. And the question we should be looking at is not whether Byju's is a $5 billion company or a $20 billion company, but what the impact of its services are on the people who need it most. Should be looking at, are these organizations creating jobs and good jobs that can that can help people achieve economic mobility, that are ideally salaried? And we can see in this chart on the left from Mint that the percentage of workers in India who are salaried has actually been falling over time, and dealing and helping us economically as well in terms of keeping inflation under control, in terms of serving the needs of customers. Those are the questions that I would say are much more valuable and much more interesting to ask than what valuation a company is at or whether a company is helping assert Indian independence and identity globally. And that they should be doing those things of trying to provide services to the people that need it in a way that's financially sustainable and ethical. And my concern is that this sort of star-studded gaze of startups is preventing us from asking the hard questions about how they should be regulated, how they should be, what laws they should come under. And we see, for instance, that with Byju's, for example, there are lots and lots of concerns about the way that it pushes its services on to people who may not know better, especially lower and middle income people, and gets them to sign up for services that then they have to pay an EMI for month on month without really understanding what they're signing up for. Or that delivery executives of Zomato or Swiggy and so on are facing a number of issues ranging from late payment to bad work conditions, and that even the companies that do go public and IPO end up struggling financially with the fact that their business fundamentals are poor and they're making huge losses, and as a result of that, their long-term performance is not necessarily going to be great. And I think a lot of this comes down to what lies behind those numbers that we talked about at the beginning. So when we talk about a venture capital company, what they basically are is they're a way for people to invest their money and make more money through that. And the way that happens is you have what are called limited partners, who are wealthy people, families, foundations, endowments of universities who invest their money into a venture capital fund. And the people who run that fund then invest it in a number of different startups. And the goal of that investment is not to say we want to invest it in companies and each company needs to be successful and profitable, but rather to invest in companies in the knowledge that 9 out of 10 companies will not return a positive investment, but in the hope that one of those startups becomes enormous, becomes a multi-billion-dollar company that can then make up for all of the others. And so that results in pushing for companies to grow larger and larger as quickly as possible, so that at least one of these companies that grows very quickly will be able to achieve an exit, which means either being bought out by a different company or going public and raising money in the stock market, and thereby receiving the money that they can then return to their investors. And so what the focus is on here is on trying to make a ton of different investments, trying to use those investments to grow the numbers in terms of the numbers of people that they are serving and the revenue that they're making as quickly as possible, even if that comes at the cost of bending regulations or not being profitable or not having a sustainable business model in the future. And I think, once again, when we look, what we need to think about is not just valuations, but what we value, and use that as an opportunity to say, being a startup, being a large company that gets a high valuation and managed to expand globally is not a source of pride in of itself. Is not something that we should be valuing in of itself, but rather we should be looking at what is the impact of this company on the people that it's serving, on stakeholders ranging from workers to society in general. And that's how we decide whether or not a company is valuable and whether a startup is valuable. And that's what will truly help us as a country achieve the greatness and the potential that we have. So that's my perspective. I'd like to thank you all for giving me this platform and an opportunity to present, and I will pass it back to you, Captain Uncle, for any questions. I think that was exactly half an hour.
Thank you, Dhruva, for that brilliant talk. Before I open the flow for questions, I mean, there is one in the chat box. This is from Lata Ranganathan. Ma'am, would you like me to read it out, or would you unmute and ask yourself? There are two questions.
Yeah. No, that's my wife's login.
Oh, I see. Who is it? I mean, would you like your Ajay?
Yeah. My name is Ranganathan. I also know Dhruv as a young, guy, as a kid. So, hi, Dhruv.
Hi,
Fantastic
Ranganathan.
presentation, and it had a lot of clarity. There are two questions I wanted to ask.
Yeah.
There I had written in the chat box.
Yeah,
One was related to what is the ratio of Indian companies becoming successful compared to the other country companies which had been taken the VC route. The second question which I had asked was, do Indian companies really understand the VC game? If you can answer that, that would be. I mean, if you feel you have the data, it's fine. But I just thought I should ask you these questions, because I felt that VC is a different game, and we technically know that out of 10 companies, 7 companies or 8 companies flop. But is this the same kind of ratio in India, or has it changed? That was my question.
That's a really good question. I actually don't know what the comparative ratios are between India and other countries. And as far as I'm aware from having had conversations in my interviews and my reading, the ratio isn't too different. So the expectation is that over 70 or 80% of investments won't return anything. In terms of whether Indian companies understand the VC game, I think at least at the top, they do very well. So you have, as I described at the beginning, a growing awareness and understanding of how the startup ecosystem works, how venture capital investment works, that they're very good at playing the VC game. If you look at IIT grads who are entering the startup scene, they know how to put together presentations to raise venture capital money. They know how to go from seed round to Series A to Series B. They know each other in the ecosystem and can figure out an exit. I don't know if knowing how to play the VC game means that they're running good businesses or doing positive things in society. I think that's a separate question, but I do think that they know how to play the VC game very well.
Thanks, Dhruv. Appreciate it.
Any more questions, ladies and gentlemen? Please unmute yourself and shoot.
Yes, sir. I have.
Yes, Emotion, please.
Dhruv, thank you very much for a very enlightening presentation for me, at least.
Yeah.
You see, one of the points.
Oh no.
Baiju and Unacademy was whether it is really meeting the requirement of education at large. But isn't that dependent on the education policy of the government?
I think that's a very good question. It's a question that I thought I would get. I'll say 3 things in response. One is the reason why I made that point is because I absolutely agree that what is going to move the needle? We have 300 million children in India today, whether they are educated, whether they are learning, whether they are set up for success, will rely much more on government policy, the state of our public education system, than on the actions of startups. And yet the amount of attention that we spend on talking about education policy versus Baiju's latest valuation round, the amount of time that the media is focusing on it, who they bring in to do these interviews, I think is wildly out of sync with that. So what I'm trying to counter is this narrative that exists, which says these startups are India's future and will solve the problems and will bring India into the 21st century. And I'm saying, if you look at education, Baiju's is like a solid business, whatever. But if we really care about bringing Indian education to the 21st century, rather than spending our time and attention and energy thinking about Baiju's, we should be thinking about kids have been out of school for almost 2 years now. How do we get them back into school? Or how do we ensure that teachers are showing up to teach? And so it's more of a, I agree with you that it's not Byju's role to fix these things. And therefore, I'm saying we should spend less time sort of obsessing over these and thinking more about the problems that actually matter.
Right. Thank you.
Of
Dhruv.
course.
Thank you.
I think the other thing is also that startups tend to be very good at talking the language of social change. So unlike a traditional company that says, we're here to make a profit and give people jobs, startups are all like, we are revolutionizing education. We're revolutionizing the healthcare system. So they claim to be making a real meaningful difference as well. So it's also a little bit about holding them to the standards that they have set for themselves.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Of course.
Any other questions? There's one more coming up on the chat box. I mean, this is from Srini Bhatt. Oh, I see one of your. Anyway, would you like to unmute and ask yourself, or should I read it out?
He's got his hand up.
You can go ahead and read it out, sir. I'm fine with that. Thank you.
All right. This is there a way to measure the true add to the country's GDP through these aggregation models? If a Flipkart is adding jobs and infra in logistics, warehousing, it's also taking away jobs of local kiranas. Got it?
Yeah, it's a really hard and deep question. I think that would be better answered by people who have a lot more mathematical and statistical ability than I do in terms of how to disaggregate all of these different things and balance them against each other. But my point was a little bit deeper than that, which is even the things that Flipkart claims to be doing, it's doing in a way that's not necessarily enormously positive. So for example, Flipkart and Zomato are very proud of the number of jobs that they are adding. But I think the question we should be asking is, are those the types of jobs that will really help a family or a person achieve economic mobility, come out of the situation they're in? And the answer to that often is a lot more complex than straightforward. So even setting aside the negatives that might be doing in terms of out-competing existing companies, I think what I'm suggesting is that we take a more critical look at the positive impacts that they claim to be having and trying to understand whether they're really what they're cut out to be.
Are there any more questions coming in? Please. It's not. It is still quite young. You can shoot your questions.
There is one in the chat box, sir.
Oh, is it? That's the one I asked. Oh, I one more. Can I ask one more? Yeah, most certainly. Mr. Ranganathan.
Yeah, I just wanted to share my experience on this online education portal and your reaction as dating back to your times of education. Actually, when my daughter was in the 10th standard or 9th standard, at that time you had this Byju online portal. So I asked my daughter, do you want to register? She said, no, I'm already registered. We are not, you don't need to pay. Then I asked her, what do you use it for? The answer was quite, shocking. She said that whenever the teacher gives me homework, I don't have to scratch my brain. I just go to this Byju kind of portal and copy it off. Now, this is what was used. When the second daughter of mine came up and I asked the same question, she said, the contents are extremely boring. Now, this has been the case even with my brother-in-law's daughter, to whom they paid for Byju and still not using it. I mean, what's your feel on the content which is being presented by this? Do you think this really helps people? To whomever I ask, parents are just spending money, but how much the kids are using, I'm not able to assess that. What's your feel on that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I haven't personally used the service, so I'm not sure. But that's the sort of thing that you would ideally want some sort of regulation around, right? The fact that we can't tell what is the measured impact of taking a Byju's class on education levels, or what's the quality and satisfaction rates of customers, those are things that they should be required to reveal, so that when they are aggressively selling it and they've got enormous sales and marketing teams where they call parents up, go to schools and trying to get students to sign up, that should be information that they are required to reveal before someone signs up. And I think that's the sort of thing that would make a big difference in pushing them to actually be providing value added services. So my short answer is I'm not sure, but it's a really good example of the type of regulation or the type of thing we should be asking of these organizations, rather than taking at face value their claims of revolutionizing education, I think.
Oh, there's another
Thanks.
one coming up.
Thanks.
Yeah.
That was a very good answer. I think I was not able to relate to your point on regulation when you made it earlier on, but it makes sense because yes, I mean, if you can't metrics the customer satisfaction or usability of a product or service, and if customer does, and if the government doesn't step in, I mean, that's good. I think you answered it. I mean, you have given a perspective which is quite interesting. Thank you very much.
Of course.
Yeah, there's another one coming up. Mr. Karchan, would you like to ask yourself, or you want me to read it out? The question is from Mr. Karchan: how can startups achieve parity in cost, say manufacturing and service costs, so that competitiveness is enabled favorably in a global sense?
Yeah, I think in some ways they're doing it in the same way that companies based in India always have, which is making use of the lower cost of labor, including highly skilled labor and of other resources and rent and all of those things, to be able to provide put together a team that's at a that's lower cost than a competitor, say, in a foreign country. And so especially when you look at the presentation is focused primarily on companies that create goods and services for customers, but there's actually an enormous set of startups which we haven't talked about really at all, which are doing services for other businesses. So this would be what are called SaaS, or software as a service, or software-enabled services for businesses. And Freshworks is an example of that. There are others as well. In that case, what they're doing is basically saying, we have a lot of technical talent in India, technical talent that's often cheaper than in the US or the UK, and we are able to create these products and services that help other companies at a much lower cost than they would in a foreign country, and so we're able to outcompete them. So those are the sorts of advantages that India has, that companies are effectively using to reduce cost. However, the other thing that they're doing is saying, our costs are not that much lower, but we'll just take on more venture capital money and use that to run an unprofitable business. So if you look at the unicorns that exist, a huge number of them are running giant losses, because what they're effectively doing is they're taking this venture capital money and using it to subsidize their business model, where they say, we will use this money to run at a loss. The goal then is to grow the number of customers we get, so that we can then sell to some other company or go public, and then the losses won't matter because they're buying us for the users we have or the technology we have. Or they're saying, we hope to eventually grow so big that we'll dominate the market, and at that point we'll become profitable. So that's the other perspective on cost, which is in some ways costs are lower, but in other ways costs are just being subsidized by venture capital money in a way that involves, at the end of the day, either passing on the buck to somebody else or dominating the market and reducing competition.
Any more questions, ladies and gentlemen? Yes, sir. Colonel Krishnaswamy, you got to unmute yourself, sir. Please unmute. You're still muted, sir. No, you're not muted. You're not unmuted.
Yes, we can hear you now.
Am I audible now?
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Now you painted a picture of a bit, shall I say, if I say, of suspicion about Beijus, if not the polite way of saying it. Are there any startups in India which have done well and which have earned the respect and they are in your eye, in your vision? What are they? Who are they?
My intention here is not to say that startups are bad or that these companies are all negative or we should be suspicious of them. What I'm trying to say is that uncritical adoration or buying into narratives in the hope of achieving some broader goal of political independence, international dominance is risky, because then it allows us to shut our eyes to the aspects of these companies that are less good or that are not achieving the ends that they are seeking to end. So what I'm arguing for is not, and I if you ask me to say, is there a single company that is all good or all bad, I'd probably not be able to give you an answer. And I think Byju's absolutely is doing a lot of good in terms of, for instance, one way of thinking about it is because Byju's exists, it is inspiring loads more people to become entrepreneurs, to enter education. It is serving, at least for people in cities, as a useful additional source of support and tuition. It's bringing a lot more teachers onto its platforms, especially women who otherwise don't have opportunities to work. So I'm not at all claiming that it's black and white. I'm just suggesting that all of these startups, all of these companies are shades of gray that we should be really aware of and vigilant of.
I appreciate what you say, but do you have any idea of somebody who's doing extremely well and probably is not able to put across the manner in which Byju has been able to market it? Are there any ones who have done extremely well? Is there a silver lining in the cloud?
Yeah, I think there's some really interesting models that exist. So a really good friend of mine from Harvard and her brother and a couple of people have started this organization called Rocket Learn. And so what they are trying to do is they call themselves a non-profit startup. I think that's the term that they use. So they're not a for-profit business, but they adopt a lot of the ideas of startups in that they want to use technology effectively. They want to have a focus on numbers and growth. They want to reach as many people as possible. And one of the models that they do is that they use WhatsApp to try and spread education to children who are in need. And because they often don't have the data or internet connection to be able to use a really heavy platform like Byju's, and as other people have mentioned, Byju's is not necessarily tailored for them. They're trying to use WhatsApp and WhatsApp groups to better provide education to as many people as possible. So I think that's the sort of orientation where you're taking the best of the startup world, which is this comfort with technology, this comfort with numbers and metrics, this comfort with growth and ambition, and channeling that both towards a real social problem and doing it in a way that is not seeking just profits and growth, which I think could be really valuable. So that's an example. I think there are definitely more like those that exist, but that's one that came to mind immediately.
Thank you.
Any more questions, please? Okay. If there are no more questions, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for honoring us by attending our event. And thank you, Dhruva, for a brilliant talk. And if you all will hold on for a minute, we'll play the national anthem to close the event. Kavya.
Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you for this opportunity again.
Thank
Good
you.
luck and
Thank you.
Godspeed.
Thank you, Dhruv. All the best to you.
Good luck and
Thanks,
Godspeed.
Dhruv. All the best, man. Thank you very much.
Thanks, NMC. Nice to see you all. So we'll
Proud parents.
I'm going to end the meeting.
Good night.
We hope
Good
to
night.
see you all again on our platform.